Hello and welcome once again to the course Life of Christ. Now we're in class 31, continuing with the series of classes on miracles of Jesus and how he interacted with different groups of people. Today we want to talk about Jesus and the lepers. And whereas the last class about the demon-possessed was one of the longest classes, this is actually one of the shortest ones. I want to invite you to go with me to Luke chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, to read the first story. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. Then Jesus ordered him, "Don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priests, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing, as a testimony to them." Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Now, this story here in Luke says it happens in one of the towns. The version in Matthew has it happening just after Jesus comes down from the Sermon on the Mount. If it is the same day, the sermon ends in chapter 7, and then in the first part of Matthew 8, then this leper comes up to him. And if that's the case, then this is about where this story might have happened. In the background, on the top right up here, you see the Mount of Beatitudes, and that's where Jesus would have been. We've shown pictures of that before. And then if you come down the mountain, here you see in the background the Via Maris, the way to the sea that runs past the Sea of Galilee. And then you see the sea itself right here. And then this whole area right here is called the area of the seven springs because there's water that comes up from the ground. In fact, you can see over here to the right, looks like a little waterfall. That's actually an underground aquifer that comes out into the sea. It's a really pleasant place to be on a hot summer day, and a lot of times people take picnics down there and they enjoy that. But this area right here was called the area of seven springs, and one of the springs was actually called the leper spring. And so some people wonder if perhaps the story happened right around here. Now there's different things about this story that are very interesting. One of the things that strikes me is when the leper says to Jesus, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." And you think about that, and a leper's life was far from easy. As you probably know, leprosy was a terrible disease that attacked not only the skin, but also even the bones of the body, and sometimes could really completely destroy a person a little bit at a time to the place where their fingers and toes might fall off, or their nose or their ears might fall off. They developed great sores all over their body. They would smell. It was just really difficult to be around. And so when someone got leprosy, they were basically exiled. And a lot of times they threw them out of the town entirely. As I understand it, they even had certain areas where the lepers set up their own towns so that they could be together because no one else wanted to be around. And it must have been very painful, obviously, for them, not only physically, but emotionally, to be exiled and put out from their families and their towns, but also, of course, for their families. So, I mean, how terrible would it be to have to kind of take a child and send that child away, knowing that that child was not going to get care, loving care from his own family. And so the whole life of a leper was terrible. And so the lepers, as they would live in the countryside or in their towns, sometimes they would beg for food, and sometimes people would go and leave food and clothing or other things near the towns or places where they knew lepers were as an act of compassion. But they still didn't want to go close to the leper because it was contagious. And so they might stand far off, and if they saw people coming and the people didn't know they were there, they had to cry out, "Unclean, unclean," and that would warn the people and they would stay away. And so they must have been used to people walking by them as fast as they could, ignoring them entirely, maybe insulting them, maybe trying to drive them further away. And so when you see this man say, Lord, if you're willing, that's not just the man being polite. Most people weren't willing. And so Jesus says, I am willing. And I think it's important that he says that. Sometimes when people come and they need help and they say, I know it's a bother, I don't want to take your time, I know that you're really busy, they're honest. They realize that what they're asking could be an imposition, could take time and money away, and they don't want to bother, but they need help. And I think when somebody can say, don't worry about that, don't worry about bothering me, I'm glad to help you, I want to help you, it's an additional blessing. On top of whatever you might give to the person, it's an additional blessing to say, you are not a bother. You are important. I am willing to do this. I'm glad to do this. I think that's a double blessing we can give to someone. And so it says, besides I am willing, be clean, it says he touched the man. And that, again, is really amazing because just like Jesus facing the demon-possessed man when he was still possessed, that's an act of courage. And Jesus touching this man is an act of courage. So many times in Jesus' ministry, you think, what if it didn't work? What if the healing didn't take or the resurrection didn't happen? What if it didn't work? This is another one of those cases. If Jesus is not right and he's not going to heal this man, then Jesus is risking leprosy as well. And so he reaches out and he touches the man, which the man must have been missing, that human touch. And then it says immediately the leprosy left him. I think that's just amazing. And you think also about this story, and you think about the laws of purity or cleanliness or uncleanness that the Jews had to follow. And the normal pattern was that they would decide what things or foods or activities would make you unclean. And then if you were with a person that was in the middle of one of those problems of uncleanness or impurity, if you touched that person or you came too near, then that impurity, that uncleanness would be transmitted to you. Just as if you're in a hospital today with a person with a contagious disease, then that disease can be transmitted to you. And so it's a danger. It's a basic health principle that if people are contagious, if they have something wrong, then you need to watch out because you could get sick too. And so this is actually a pretty natural thing to separate from what's impure, because usually the impure person makes the pure person unclean. The sick person makes the healthy person sick, right? That's usually the way it goes. If I go to visit somebody in the hospital that's got a contagious disease, my wellness is usually not the contagious part. I don't make the person well. My health is not contagious. It usually goes the other way around. And it was that way with the Jewish laws. The impurity made other people impure. But in this case, we see that Jesus' purity and his power, the fact that he was the God who could provide all health, we see that went the other way. And his purity was communicated to the man. The man became pure and well because of what Jesus did. And I want to suggest that that's the way it should happen. That's one of the blessings of Christianity, that instead of being affected, instead of getting sick or becoming impure, becoming more sinful, that Christians can be the salt and light, and they can communicate that to other people instead of being affected. Now think about that in the circles in which you operate, whether with your family, whether with friends, people at your job. There are some people that are Christian and some unchristian. If you think about a college context, about a Christian roommate and a non-Christian roommate, my question would be, which way does that go? Which way does the sin or the purity go? Or a workplace where there's Christians and non-Christians. Do the Christians communicate their example and their relationship with Jesus in such a way that other people want to become Christians, and so that workplace becomes more Christian? Does the Christian roommate act and speak in such a way where the non-Christian roommate is attracted by that and then becomes Christian, becomes more pure? Does it go that way? Or are the Christians in the room or the workplace affected so much by the non-Christians that the Christians become more sinful? Which way does it go? I think we've all known cases where it's gone both ways. Okay, so in the natural world, the natural thing to happen is for impurity to have more influence. In the spiritual world in which we operate, what should happen and can happen is that the pure people, the peoples whose purity comes from Jesus, that can and should be communicated to other people. I think that's a great principle, and we don't often think about it specifically. We don't often plan for that to happen. What are the ways in which I can be such a good example, can share the love and compassion of Christ in such a way that I can help other people become better? It's not a matter of being superior to people. It's not a matter of seeing how terrible people are and talking down to them or looking down on them. It's just a matter of wanting to share Jesus' love and compassion in such a way where you make others better. And I think that's a challenge for all of us, no matter where we are. And God can do that through each one of us. That's part of what being salt and light means, is sharing that to other people instead of being affected by them. I'm reminded of a story that I heard one time that I thought was kind of funny. It's about a quarterback that was playing for a college, and as he came into the program, they noticed that he had trouble with his weight. He would just overeat and like to a tremendous extent. And so they put him on a special diet for 2 weeks, and they weighed him after the 2 weeks, and he gained weight. And so they restricted his diet even more, and they come back 2 weeks later, weigh again. He's even heavier. He hasn't lost a pound. He's gained more. And so finally they said, well, this is pretty extreme. So they took one of the personal trainers from the college, and they had the trainer go live with this guy, this quarterback, for another 2 weeks, because he was supposed to watch everything he ate, make sure he wasn't sneaking any food in late at night, to show him, give him a good example, help him cook his meals, be healthy as possible. They thought maybe this day and night, around the clock attention will help out. And so they did that for 2 weeks, and they came back and they weighed the guy. And not only the quarterback, but also the personal trainer had gained more weight. And so in that case, the personal trainer was supposed to communicate his healthiness in a better way to the quarterback, and he ended up going down the same road as the quarterback and getting heavier. So that's kind of funny, but it's not as funny when, as Christians, we let other people, unchristians, affect us more than we affect them for good. So something to think about. Now let's go on in another part of Luke, and let's jump over to chapter 17. Jump over to chapter 17. Before we do that, let me talk about this one thing here. When Jesus says in this story, now go and show yourself to the priest, that was part of the law. That was kind of a checkup, like we might go back to the doctor to see if we're well. That was kind of what the priests were supposed to do. You're supposed to show yourself to the priest, and then the priest could pronounce you well so that everyone would know that you were pure again, and you could go back and resume a normal life with everybody else. Now, the place that the leper might have done this in Galilee, if he is there near Capernaum where we saw the picture, that would have probably been one of the priests in Capernaum, for example. But there was a place in the temple for priests, for lepers to go show themselves to the priest. And so we look at this model of the temple in the first century, and we see that in the court of prayer, this big area right here, in the court of women, as it's also called, we see that there are 4 corners here, and 2 of the corners are storage places for wood and oil they use for the sacrifices. And then 2 of the storage places are for the Nazarites, those who are taking the Nazarite vow. And then this one up here at the top right of this courtyard is actually the place for the lepers to go and show themselves to the priest and be pronounced pure. My question would be, if they're not sure the lepers are pure, isn't it kind of odd that they let the lepers this far in to the temple complex? What happens if they weren't clean by that time? But maybe they had some system of taking care of that. All right, now let's go over to Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17. And let's begin in verse 11. This is toward the end of Jesus' ministry. Now he's leaving Galilee and going on his way to Jerusalem for the last week of his life. It says, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. When he saw them, he said, go, show yourselves to the priests. And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? Then he said to him, rise and go, your faith has made you well. Pretty typical in some ways. We see what we just talked about the men being outside the village, calling from a distance, asking for help, and then Jesus says the same thing to them as he said to the first leper. And I like this one phrase in verse 14. It says, as they went, they were cleansed. And I wonder how that worked exactly, because in the case of the first leper, he was immediately healed, and he could look down at his body and see that he was healed. But it says this healing didn't happen until they were cleansed and until they were on their way, and then they were cleansed. So you wonder, well, did they think that perhaps it was a slow acting healing? Did they not see any changes but take by faith that they were healed? But it says that as they went, they were healed. And sometimes Jesus works that way. Sometimes he says, okay, I want you to start and do things that I'm telling you to do. I want you to be obedient. And it may be that for a while, as you're obedient, you won't see any changes. But then as you continue to obey, then you'll see how God is working in you. It's the same question I have about the leper Naaman in the Old Testament, in 2 Kings 5, I believe, where he goes and asks for help from Elisha. And Elisha says, go dip 7 times in the Jordan River. And so Naaman doesn't like that at first. He says, we got cleaner rivers back home in Syria. But eventually he goes and he does it. And as he's dipping 7 times, I wonder how the healing is. Is the healing where he dips 1 time and he comes back up and looks, because you would look, right, after the first time to see if it's gotten better. And you wonder if he noticed a little improvement. Some of the sores didn't look as bad. Looked a little bit less red, maybe. And then he dips another time and he looks again, and maybe it's a little bit better. I wonder if it's a gradual healing where every time he goes down and comes back up and looks, he's more and more encouraged and more convinced, hey, this is really healing me. And so that would be even more encouraging to continue to do what Elisha had said. Go all the way to 7 times. Don't stop after 1 or 3 or 5. Or I wonder if the first 6 times he went down and came back up and looked, if there was no change. And if that's the case, it would have been a lot harder to continue. 1 time, 2 times nothing, 3 times nothing, 4 times nothing. And by this time you're thinking, I'm starting to feel foolish. Is this Elisha, really telling me what's true? Does he have any power? Am I just making a fool of myself here, baptizing myself over and over in the Jordan? And then the 7th time he goes down and he comes up and he's completely healed, just instantly. And if that's the case, then it took more faith to continue to be obedient through the first 6 baptisms until finally, as you finish what you've been sent to do, then the healing is complete. And I think God tends to work in both ways. I think sometimes as we obey, we notice small improvements and we notice we're getting better. We're feeling better. We're acting better. It's getting easier. And other times it seems like we slog on for, maybe months at a time and we don't notice any change. And we begin to question if it really works, if it really matters, if we're doing it wrong, if God really loves us, if God is even there paying attention to us. And then all of a sudden, maybe something happens and we realize God has been working all along. We just didn't see it or feel it. And then we see what God has done in our lives. I think he does both ways. And so the important thing here for these men is that they were all obedient. Now, as we see in the story, they weren't all grateful. Only 10%, 1 out of the 10, were grateful, and it says he was a Samaritan or a foreigner, as Jesus says. And I don't think he says it in an insulting fashion, this foreigner. I think he just is amazed that the Jews who should know God and be more grateful are not, and the Samaritan is grateful, and he commends him for his faith. I had a professor one time in school, John Willis, say that he thought that perhaps the two sins that were the root of all the other sins were ingratitude and pride, that you could trace in some way all the sins to one of those. And if that's the case, this ingratitude is not just a small thing. Sometimes we don't feel too badly if we don't say thank you or we're not grateful, when actually it's a huge thing to be grateful and to recognize that God has blessed us in a number of different ways. And we kind of ignore the process of showing gratitude to God and to others, or we downplay it. And so you think about, as you go through your life, is it possible to go through one whole day without complaining, and instead of complaining, giving thanks for everything, even things that are difficult or bad or that seem bad? Is it possible to do that? And one time I was reading this story with a group of ladies, and I said, do you think it's possible to go a whole day without complaining? And instead of complaining, giving thanks? And they said, oh, no, I don't think we can. I said, okay, well, do you think we can go like this morning without complaining the rest of the morning? And they looked at me and thought, no, probably not. So I said, well, how about an hour? Can you go an hour without complaining? And they said, we're not sure if we can do that either. Now, I don't think this one group of ladies was any worse than any group of men or people anywhere. But it struck me, say, wow, is the act of complaining so ingrained in us? Are we that ungrateful as people that we would want to complain continually? And if it is, that's something I think God would want us to change, to take that evil spirit of complaining out and replace it with a spirit of gratitude, that we could actually look around and be grateful for everything. One person asked a question one time. They said, what would we have if God took away everything that we had complained about, that we just lost it? What would we have left? Maybe not much, because sometimes we complain about everything, even the good things or the good people in our lives, we complain about them. We might not have much left. Or ask a different way, what if one day God took away everything that we had not specifically thanked him for? And again, we might not have much left, because we get used to the good things God has all around us, and we think that we deserve them or they'll always be there, and we really don't even think about them anymore. And then we find other things to gripe about. I know that I could do better at this a lot. I need to work more on being thankful for the good things I have, enjoying the little things and the big things, and not complaining as much about things, because people would look at my life and say, you don't have anything to complain about. You're very blessed, and that's true. And I think a lot of us could say the same things. And even if we do have things that are difficult that we could complain about, I think if we face those with the spirit of gratitude and thankfulness, even in the middle of problems, I think those will be easier to bear, and I think God will be more pleased with us. So some of the stories about Jesus and lepers, and in a more general sense, how we operate in our lives. Hope this has been a blessing for you. See you next time.